Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, philosophy students. We now take up again Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I hope you all had a wonderful Easter break and are now ready to get into our final few classes and the end of the semester. And the end will come quickly. It'll be here before you know it. So today, this is our online class for Wednesday, April the 15th, and I believe it's our 11th online class. Today we take up pages 20 to 65 in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So one of the things that you remember so far is that Frankl notices that there were 3 stages to the prisoner's experience, and therefore 3 stages that we might notice ourselves in terms of our own experience. Those 3 stages are, first of all, the period immediately following imprisonment, characterized by shock, and then the long period of imprisonment, characterized by apathy, and finally, the very brief period at the end of liberation, characterized by bitterness and disillusionment. Now, once again, to get the most out of this book, think of what Frankl is saying in terms of your own suffering. We're paying attention to the details that he's giving about the concentration camp because that's what we're working through. We're not studying it because it's a concentration camp experience. We're studying it because of what it tells us about our own suffering, however severe or grave or light that suffering might be. So essentially around page 20 is when Frankl enters into the second phase, the long period of imprisonment. And this is the period that we all experience when we know there's not going to be a reprieve. We know something has happened. It can't be changed. We're just going to have to get used to it. We're going to have to live with it. And it's not unusual for us to experience at that point, and sometimes during that long period, a feeling of apathy. So this is where Frankl begins around page 20. And one of the things that he remarks on is what he calls the mortification of normal reactions. We no longer react in the same way. We no longer seem to care in the same way. We no longer seem to get excited in the same way. Everything just sort of reaches a leveling point where, in a sense, it's almost like we're saying to ourselves that things don't really matter in the same way. We don't know, for example, in terms of this corona crisis that we're in currently, how long it's going to last. We know kind of when we went into it as a university, it was March 11th that the day was announced. We'd had normal classes that morning, and all of a sudden then we don't. And now we've been in it for over a month, and probably we have become, to some extent, somewhat apathetic about what happens, what we can do. We've gotten used to the fact that we can't go certain places, we can't do certain things. We've just kind of become accustomed to it. And what you find is, and this is what Frankl's remarking on, is that your emotional reaction to that lessens. It lessens in the sense that you no longer have as great of a reaction as you once might have had. For example, somebody says, can't go to the grocery store. What do you mean I can't go to the grocery store? And now it's, yeah, I know, can't go to the grocery store. Can't go a lot of other places, can't do a lot of other things, can't see in person, at least, a lot of other people. For those of us who are churchgoers, that whole experience has changed. We've experienced online masses and drive-in benedictions, or at least that's one of the things that we have here. But we haven't been gathering in the church with a large number of people. Some churches, many churches in fact, are still open for private prayer, but not for the typical church services. And so this is what Frankl is talking about in terms of this experience that you get into and you become accustomed to it in not such a good way. Your feelings, as he says, become blunted. And he has an interesting experience that I want you to take note of. I'm not going to review it in detail, but it's on pages 22 and 23, where he served, and this is the only time he says that he served as a physician in the concentration camp. It's a very interesting experience that he relates when he was working as a doctor in the typhus hut. So take a look at that on pages 22 and 23. Of course, the prisoners were beaten regularly. And Frankl notes that it really wasn't the physical suffering that was the greatest torment, but rather, he says, it was the unreasonable nature of these beatings, of the constant harassment. It wasn't so much that it was harmful physically. They had already been harmed almost beyond reason, but it was just the idea that one human being would actually treat another human being in this way. There were many elements of self-defense, not self-defense in terms of fighting, but mechanisms of self-defense. Apathy was one. Different emotions that the prisoners experienced was another. Humor was a mechanism of defense. And Frankl notes a very curious incident when during the night a prisoner was having a nightmare. And he was about to wake him up, about to stretch out his hand to shake him and wake him up. And he realized that the reality that he would be waking the prisoner back up into was far harsher than any nightmare that the prisoner could possibly be having. Frankl uses an interesting term at the top of page 30. It's a short little phrase called provoke the organism. And this is in the section where Frankl is discussing the way in which prisoners thought about and talked about food. Food was scarce, right? They didn't get a whole lot to eat. And, you might think of it again in terms of certain experiences that you're deprived of during this time. And so Frankl asks a very pointed question. Is it a good idea to provoke the organism? Is it a good idea to dwell on things that you know that you can't have? Or is it a good thing to dwell on activities that you know that you cannot engage in? Now, is this a little bit similar to the story that we saw in the Republic of Leontius, who was walking up the wall and saw the corpses, and at first he restrained himself. He had custody of the eyes, and he did not look at the corpses. But then, in a little while, he just sort of gave in and said, open wide, have your fill of the sight, you evil wretches. This is similar to what Frankl's talking about here. How much should we dwell on that which we either can't or shouldn't have? So in our experience, we're not deprived of food, for example. We're not deprived really of a whole lot of anything, even in this time of crisis. But we know that there are certain things that we should deprive ourselves of. And so Frankl's question is, how much do you reflect on that? How much do you meditate on that? How much do you think about that? And as he says at the bottom of page 29, he always regarded discussions of food to be dangerous. Now then, there are many things on many pages that we can't go over in detail, so I'm going to try to hit as many highlights as possible. One of the interesting distinctions that Frankl makes, and he makes this in the context of talking about the religious interests of prisoners. He thought originally that if you were of a more robust physical makeup, that you would be better able to withstand the hardships and the tortures of camp life. What he found, though, however, was that those who were more physically robust and did not have the inner kind of spiritual or intellectual or religious depth, even though they had the physical strength, they were not able to withstand the hardships of the camp, as well as those who were weaker physically, but who had a deeper life of another sort, a deeper life of thought, of reflection, might be religion, spirituality, and so forth. He found that those individuals who were able to think a little bit more deeply about the meaning of it all were able to withstand the awful experiences quite a bit better. And it's in this context that he makes several pages worth of comments about the role of love. And these run anywhere from about 37 to 39 and beyond. It was a way, he said, this experience of love, this reflecting on love, was a way of dealing with the emptiness and the desolation of what they were going through. And always, he says, prisoners, himself included, were trying, as he says on page 40, to try to find the reason for their sufferings. This is what we always ask when we're suffering. Why? You know, we ask this about what we're going through now. Why did this crop up all of a sudden? Why did this happen? But we can ask it about individual sufferings of different types. Again, it might be a loss of a loved one, might be a physical injury. I know a person who has recently broken his leg in two places, now relatively incapacitated in some ways, wondering why. Why does this happen? And various things like this hit us all through our life. This is part of the reason that I encourage you to keep this book and to reread it every 5 or 10 years, because you'll be at a different place. You may have different injuries, different hurts, different problems, different sufferings, and what this book is saying will mean something different in all of those events in your life. So it's good to keep it on hand to reread it. On page 43, for example, you'll notice Frankl calling upon his sense of humor. Now, he's not saying to laugh at things that are serious. He's not saying to make fun of the suffering. Just like now in this crisis, wouldn't be saying to just laugh it all off and go do foolish and frivolous things. The sense of humor is a way of just dealing with it in sort of an inner sense and dealing with it in terms of the people around you. It's noticing that we're still alive, we're still active, we can still look towards the future. So some of the things that happen can only be taken with a sense of humor. So I point that out to you. For example, page 43 is a good place where he begins to look at humor as a method of self-preservation. Interesting analogy on page 44. Suffering, he says, is like a gas pumped into an empty chamber. The gas will completely fill up the chamber, regardless of how small or large the chamber is. So he says, likewise, suffering completely fills the human soul and the conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is little or great. Therefore, Frankl says, the size of suffering, and you notice he has the word size in scare quotes, the size of suffering is absolutely relative. So be careful about observing somebody else's suffering and either saying about that person or to that person, oh, it's not really that bad. Maybe objectively speaking, that's true. But for that individual, the suffering can be very great. It's up to the individual, him or herself, to reflect upon the suffering and to come to grips with its severity in their own lives. There is some elements of what Frankl is saying here that are illustrated very well in this story, which appears on page 56, Story of Death in Tehran. And this is a story, it's a very interesting little story of a master and a servant walking through the garden. And the servant experiences death, sees death. It's kind of a mythical story. It's like death is appearing to him like a ghost. And so the servant says to the master that he had just encountered death. He's scared to death. No pun intended. Sorry. He's scared that he's going to experience death literally. So he asks the master if he can have the fastest horse in the stable to get away to Tehran. The master says, yes, take the fastest horse, get away as quickly as possible and as far away as possible. Go to Tehran. The master keeps walking around the garden. He himself encounters death, and the master says to death, why did you frighten my servant? And the death says, well, actually, I didn't intend to frighten your servant, but I was just so surprised to see him here when I intended to meet up with him tonight in Tehran. This is what Frankl is calling fate. Sometimes the circumstances of our lives are simply beyond our control. Again, our own situation, not being in school and all of this. No one would, or at least I don't think anybody would voluntarily sign up for online classes like this. In certain other areas of life, perhaps. But certain circumstances are simply beyond our control. Those instances oftentimes which cause us suffering are indeed beyond our control. And Frankl says there just has to be a certain level of acceptance, has to be a certain level of not trying to be too much in control, knowing what you can control, knowing what you can't control. Accepting what you can't control is very important for an individual's own peace and serenity. Now, once again, I am skipping a number of pages just out of necessity with regard to time. We get to a very important point on page 65, the last of the pages that we're considering. And in the middle of this page, Frankl says, but what about human liberty? He's asking the question about our freedom. He's asking the question of, have we lost all of our freedom when we're in a situation of intense and extreme sufferings? Frankl's position is that we can lose almost everything. We can lose even a lot of our freedom. But there's one element of freedom that cannot be lost. And that, he says, is the freedom to choose how we will react to the situation in which we find ourselves. So Frankl is not what we would call philosophically a determinist. And if you notice, Frankl says, he asks a couple more questions here on page 65. What about human liberty? He says, is that theory true? That theory, we'll say what that theory is. Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors? Is that theory true? That's the theory of determinism. Determinism says that there is no human free will. And Frankl says we can answer the question about that theory called determinism in one of two ways. We can answer it in principle, and we can answer it from experience. So let's think first, how do we deal with the theory of determinism in principle? So here's the statement. Human beings do not have free will. True or false? Now, if you say that that statement is true, that it's true that human beings do not have free will, you've actually done what you wouldn't be able to do if that sentence were really true. You can look at it another way. You can look at it in a different phrase. Take the sentence, determinism is true. And remember what determinism says. Human beings do not have free will. Determinism is true. Say it's like a quiz. You mark that true, right? Determinism is true. However, if you say that determinism is true, you have automatically done what the theory of determinism says that it is impossible for you to do. Namely, make a choice, make a judgment. So in that sense, in the sense that the theory of determinism is self-refuting, Frankl says we can deal with it in principle. Another thing to remember about the idea that determinism is self-refuting, if determinism were really true, that we can make no judgments, that effectively does away with knowledge. Without judgments about the true and the false, there is no knowledge. So Frankl says that that is the element of dealing with that theory in principle. Just as importantly, we deal with that theory of determinism from our own common human experience. We know that we make choices, and we know that it's really impossible, and this is something you may recall that kind of harks all the way back to Descartes, when he was asking questions about could we be deceived, could we be dreaming, and so forth. We saw that there's really no way for that to be possible. To be deceived would be to be thinking. To be thinking would be to be existing, right? And so Frankl is sort of, not saying exactly the same thing as in the way that Descartes said it, but sort of the same thing, right? That we do experience the reality of making choices. And we experience it most specifically and most importantly when we are making choices about how we will deal with an experience of suffering. We don't just automatically find ourselves accepting suffering. We just don't automatically just find ourselves saying, oh, well, this isn't too bad. No, we have to make a choice. So choices are key in not only dealing with suffering, but in dealing with life in general. Okay, so we are now up to page 65. We haven't covered everything in those pages, and I've given you just a few questions. There will be more questions coming up, next class and so forth. So we've got at least a couple of more classes left on Frankl. We have, counting today, 4 classes altogether. So today, Friday, Monday on Frankl, and then another class of wrap-up. So we basically have, counting today, 4 classes left. So time is moving on. I'll see you soon.